Welcome. Take a moment and ask yourself one question.
What if the life you're living today is simply the result of the brain you've trained over the last few years?
Not your luck, not your circumstances, not your past. Your habits. Because every thought you repeat, every action you take, and every decision you make is shaping the neural circuits that determine who you'll become tomorrow. The incredible part is this: your brain is designed to change. That means your future is not fixed. It's being built right now through the choices you make every single day. So if you're ready to understand how real transformation happens, not through motivation, but through science-backed principles and consistent action, then stay with me until the end. Let's begin. Most people believe that change begins with motivation. They wait to feel inspired before they take action. They wait for confidence before they start the workout, launch the business, study for the exam, or have the difficult conversation. But from what we know about the brain and human behavior, that's actually the reverse of how lasting transformation happens. Your brain does not wait for you to become a different person before it changes. It changes because you repeatedly behave like the person you want to become. This is one of the most powerful ideas you can understand. Every action you take is sending information to your nervous system. Your brain is constantly asking one question: what should I become more efficient at? It doesn't judge whether the behavior is good or bad. It simply adapts to what you do repeatedly. If you spend hours every day scrolling through short-form content, your brain becomes more efficient at seeking constant novelty and rapid rewards. If you spend time reading, solving problems, practicing a skill, or sitting with focused attention, your brain becomes better at concentration, patience, and deep thinking. This process is called neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself throughout life. For many years, scientists believed that the brain stopped changing after childhood. We now know that's simply not true. Your brain remains capable of building new neural connections, strengthening existing ones, and even weakening pathways that are no longer useful. In other words, the version of yourself that exists today is not permanent. It is continuously being shaped by what you repeatedly choose to do. What's fascinating is that your brain doesn't care about your intentions nearly as much as it cares about your behaviors. You can tell yourself every morning that you're going to become disciplined, healthier, more confident, or more successful. But if your daily actions don't support those goals, your nervous system receives a completely different message. The brain always believes behavior over words. Think about learning any new skill, whether it's playing an instrument, speaking another language, lifting weights, or improving your communication. The first attempts usually feel awkward. That's not because you're incapable. It's because your brain hasn't built efficient circuits for that behavior yet. Every repetition strengthens those circuits. Every focused attempt sends a signal that says, "This matters, keep this pathway." Gradually, something that once required enormous mental effort begins to feel natural. This is why consistency beats intensity almost every time. A single burst of motivation may produce temporary results, but repeated behaviors reshape the architecture of the brain itself. Small actions performed consistently create changes that become increasingly automatic. The goal is not to perform perfectly once. The goal is to give your nervous system enough repetitions that the behavior becomes part of who you are. Another important point is that the brain changes most effectively when you're actively engaged. Passive wishing creates very little adaptation. Active participation creates change. When you challenge yourself just beyond your current ability, your brain pays attention. It recognizes that something important is happening and begins strengthening the neural pathways involved in meeting that challenge. This also explains why the beginning of any meaningful change feels uncomfortable. When you're creating a new habit, your brain is using circuits that are still weak and inefficient. That requires more energy, more attention, and more conscious effort. Many people interpret this discomfort as a sign that they're not meant for the task. In reality, it's often evidence that the brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, building new pathways. Over time, those repeated actions reduce the amount of effort required. Behaviors that once demanded constant self-control begin to happen with much less resistance. This is not because you suddenly became more motivated. It's because your brain became more efficient. The neural pathways have been reinforced enough that the behavior now requires less conscious effort. There's another layer to this that's incredibly important. Every repeated behavior doesn't just change what you're capable of doing, it changes what you believe about yourself. Identity is not built through affirmations alone, it's built through evidence. Each time you keep a promise to yourself, complete a difficult task, or remain consistent despite discomfort, your brain collects proof that this is who you are. Confidence emerges as a consequence of repeated action, not as a prerequisite for it. So if you're waiting to feel like a different person before you start acting differently, you'll likely remain stuck. But if you begin acting differently, even in small ways, your brain starts adapting to those actions. Over days, weeks, and months, Those adaptations accumulate. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. What once required discipline becomes routine. And eventually, without even noticing the exact moment it happened, you realize that you haven't simply changed your habits, you've changed your brain. And in doing so, you've changed your life. One of the biggest misconceptions about success is that people believe motivation comes first, followed by effort. They assume that once they feel inspired, energized, or emotionally ready, taking action will become easy. But if you look closely at how the brain actually works, you'll find something very different. Motivation is not a fixed resource that appears before action. In many cases, motivation is generated because of action. The willingness to continue often grows after you begin, not before. This is closely tied to how the brain processes reward. Most people think reward is something that arrives at the finish line, a promotion, a completed project, a healthier body, or a personal achievement. While those outcomes certainly activate the brain's reward systems, they're not what sustain long-term change. Lasting transformation depends on learning to experience satisfaction during the process itself. The challenge is that modern life trains us to expect immediate rewards. Every notification, every social media update, every piece of entertainment provides quick stimulation with very little effort. Over time, the brain begins to associate reward with instant gratification rather than meaningful work. As a result, activities that require patience, studying, exercising, building a business, writing, learning a skill can feel unusually difficult, not because they are impossible, but because they don't provide immediate feedback. This creates a dangerous cycle. People avoid difficult work because it feels uncomfortable. They seek easy rewards instead. The brain learns that avoiding effort is rewarding, making it even harder to engage in meaningful challenges the next day. Eventually, people begin believing they lack discipline, when in reality, they've simply trained their reward system to expect constant convenience. Fortunately, the opposite is also true. The brain can be trained to associate effort itself with reward. This doesn't happen overnight, but it happens through repeated experiences where you consciously recognize the value of showing up, regardless of the outcome. Every time you complete a difficult workout, finish a focused work session, read another chapter, practice a new skill, or solve a challenging problem, you create an opportunity to reinforce the idea that effort is worthwhile. The important distinction is where you place your attention. If your mind is only focused on the final result, you'll constantly feel like you're falling short until that goal is achieved. But if you begin noticing satisfaction in completing today's work, regardless of how small it seems, you shift the brain's reward system toward consistency instead of perfection. Think about someone learning a musical instrument. During the first few weeks, they don't sound impressive. Progress feels slow. Mistakes are constant. If they judge every practice session by how good they sound, they'll probably quit. But if they begin appreciating the act of practicing itself, every repetition becomes rewarding. The process becomes meaningful long before mastery arrives. The same principle applies to physical training. The strongest athletes don't wake up every day feeling excited to train. They simply develop a relationship with effort where showing up becomes part of who they are. The satisfaction comes from honoring the commitment, not just from winning competitions or reaching a specific number on the scale. This shift also changes how you respond to setbacks. When your only source of motivation is achieving the goal, failure feels devastating because it removes the reward. But when effort becomes rewarding, setbacks lose much of their emotional power. A difficult day doesn't erase progress because progress is measured by engagement, not perfection. Another fascinating aspect of the brain is that it remembers emotional experiences associated with behaviors. If every work session is accompanied by thoughts like, "I hate this," or "this is miserable," the brain begins associating focused work with negative emotions. Over time, starting becomes increasingly difficult. However, if after completing a challenging task, you take a moment to recognize what you've accomplished, not by celebrating the outcome, but by acknowledging your willingness to engage in difficult work, you create a different emotional association. The brain starts linking effort with pride, competence, and personal growth rather than exhaustion and frustration. This doesn't mean pretending difficult work is easy. It isn't. Effort requires energy. Concentration requires mental resources. Growth is often uncomfortable, but discomfort and suffering are not the same thing. Discomfort is a signal that you're operating beyond your current level of adaptation. That's exactly where learning occurs. Many people spend years searching for the perfect morning routine, the perfect productivity system, or the perfect motivational speech. They believe there's a secret that will eliminate resistance. In reality, resistance is part of the process. The goal isn't to remove it. The goal is to change your relationship with it. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid hard work?" begin asking, "How do I become someone who values hard work?" That subtle shift changes everything. You're no longer waiting for external rewards to validate your efforts. You're allowing the effort itself to become evidence that you're growing. Over weeks and months, something remarkable begins to happen. The work that once felt overwhelming becomes familiar. Your attention improves. Your resilience increases. Your confidence becomes quieter but much stronger because it's no longer based on temporary emotions. It's built on repeated evidence that you can consistently do things that are difficult. And perhaps the most important realization is this: the people who achieve extraordinary results are not necessarily those who experience the most motivation. More often, they're the people who have trained their brains to derive satisfaction from the daily process of improvement. They don't chase excitement, they build consistency. They don't wait to feel ready. They begin anyway, trusting that every meaningful repetition is shaping the brain, strengthening the mind, and moving them closer to becoming the person they set out to be. One of the greatest barriers to personal growth is the misunderstanding of discomfort. Most people interpret discomfort as a warning sign. They assume that if something feels difficult, uncertain, or mentally demanding, it must be the wrong path. But when you examine how the brain learns and adapts, you find that discomfort is not necessarily a signal to stop. Very often, it is a sign that meaningful change is taking place. The nervous system is designed to conserve energy. From an evolutionary perspective, efficiency has always been essential for survival. Your brain naturally prefers familiar behaviors because familiar behaviors require less energy and involve less uncertainty. That's why routines feel comfortable, even when they no longer serve your goals. The brain recognizes predictable patterns and executes them with minimal effort. The moment you decide to change something, whether it's waking up earlier, exercising consistently, learning a new skill, improving your communication, or breaking an unhealthy habit, you disrupt that efficiency. Suddenly, your brain must recruit additional attention, create new patterns of activity, and manage uncertainty. Naturally, this feels uncomfortable. Many people mistake that feeling for failure. In reality, it's often evidence that your nervous system is working exactly as it should. Think about the first time you tried something completely unfamiliar. Maybe it was driving a car, speaking in front of an audience, or learning a complex piece of software. At first, every step demanded conscious attention. You had to think about things that now seem automatic. Over time, through repetition, those actions became easier. Not because the task changed, but because your brain became more efficient at performing it. This principle applies to every meaningful area of life. Confidence feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. Discipline feels uncomfortable before it becomes routine. Leadership feels uncomfortable before it becomes part of your identity. Growth always begins with temporary inefficiency. One reason people abandon change too early is because they expect progress to feel rewarding immediately. Instead, the early stages often involve frustration. Mistakes become more visible. Weaknesses become impossible to ignore. The gap between where you are and where you want to be suddenly feels enormous. But that awareness is actually valuable. You cannot improve something your brain refuses to acknowledge. The moment you recognize a weakness clearly, your nervous system now has accurate information about what needs attention. Awareness creates the opportunity for adaptation. There's another fascinating aspect of learning. The brain changes most effectively when you're paying close attention during moments of challenge. Passive repetition has limited value. Active engagement, especially when the task demands concentration, creates stronger and more durable neural changes. This explains why difficult work often produces the greatest growth. When you're fully engaged in solving a challenging problem, learning a complicated concept, or performing a demanding physical task, your brain recognizes that these experiences matter. It allocates resources towards strengthening the circuits involved in that activity. The key is remaining in a zone that's challenging without becoming overwhelming. If something is too easy, your brain has little reason to adapt. If it's impossibly difficult, frustration can dominate attention, making learning less effective. The ideal environment for growth is one where success is possible but requires sustained effort. This also changes how you should think about failure. Failure is often viewed as evidence of limited ability, but from the perspective of learning, mistakes provide essential feedback. Every error reveals information about what your brain has not yet mastered. That information guides future adjustments. Imagine trying to improve your aim in archery while never seeing where your arrows land. Improvement would be nearly impossible because you'd have no feedback. Mistakes serve the same purpose. They show you where adjustment is needed. People who improve consistently don't avoid mistakes. They analyze them. Instead of asking, "Why am I so bad at this?" they ask, "What is this mistake teaching me?" That single shift transforms frustration into curiosity. Curiosity is one of the most powerful mental states for learning because it keeps attention engaged instead of shutting it down through self-criticism. Another important point is that emotional discomfort and physical discomfort often overlap during growth. When you challenge yourself, your heart rate may increase, your breathing may change, you may feel nervous before giving a presentation, or anxious before attempting something unfamiliar. Many people interpret these physical sensations as proof they shouldn't continue. But these physiological responses are normal. They simply indicate that your body is mobilizing energy to meet a challenge. The interpretation of those sensations matters enormously. If you label them as danger, performance often declines. If you recognize them as preparation, your mind remains focused on the task instead of the feeling. This perspective doesn't eliminate discomfort. It gives discomfort a purpose. Over time, repeated exposure changes your relationship with challenge. The presentation that once terrified you becomes manageable. The workout that once exhausted you becomes part of your routine. The difficult conversations you used to avoid become opportunities for growth instead of sources of fear. Nothing external has fundamentally changed. Your nervous system has adapted. This is why resilience isn't something people are born with. It's something that develops through repeated experiences of facing manageable challenges and discovering that you can handle them. Every time you choose growth over comfort, your brain gathers evidence. Every difficult conversation completed, every early morning honored, every distraction resisted, every promise kept. Each one reinforces the idea that discomfort is temporary, but adaptation is lasting. Eventually, something remarkable happens. The situations that once felt impossible no longer demand extraordinary courage. They become familiar territory. Not because life became easier, but because your brain became stronger. And that's one of the most empowering truths about human potential. The discomfort you experience today is often the very process that is preparing you for the person you're capable of becoming tomorrow. The obstacle isn't standing in the way of your growth. It is, in many cases, the mechanism through which growth occurs. Every day, whether you realize it or not, you're training your brain. The question is never whether your brain is changing. The question is what direction it's changing in. Every decision you make, every habit you repeat, every thought you reinforce, and every action you perform leaves a small imprint on your nervous system. Most of these changes are subtle. You don't notice them from one day to the next, but over weeks, months, and years, they accumulate into something much larger. They become your default way of thinking, behaving, and responding to the world. This is why your daily routine is far more important than your occasional bursts of motivation. A single productive day doesn't transform your life, just as one unhealthy meal doesn't destroy your health. What matters is repetition. The brain is designed to recognize patterns. When it detects that a behavior occurs consistently, it begins optimizing itself around that behavior. It starts making those actions more automatic, requiring less conscious effort over time. This process is both empowering and dangerous. It's empowering because positive habits become easier the longer you practice them. It's dangerous because negative habits follow the exact same rules. The brain doesn't assign moral value to behaviors. It doesn't distinguish between productive routines and destructive ones. It simply strengthens whatever pathways are activated repeatedly. If you spend every evening learning, reading, exercising, or developing a valuable skill, those circuits become stronger. If you spend every evening procrastinating, seeking constant distraction, or avoiding meaningful work, those pathways become stronger as well. Your brain is always learning from your behavior. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that identity changes first and habits follow. They say things like, once I'm disciplined, I'll wake up early, or once I become confident, I'll start speaking up. But the nervous system works in the opposite direction. Your repeated actions gradually shape your identity. You don't become disciplined and then create disciplined habits. You create disciplined habits until discipline becomes part of who you are. This is why consistency matters so much more than intensity. An intense burst of effort may feel satisfying in the moment, but sustainable routines create lasting neurological change. Even small daily improvements have enormous effects because they provide continuous reinforcement to the brain. Every repetition tells your nervous system, this behavior matters, make it easier to perform tomorrow. Another critical element of this process is sleep. Many people think of sleep simply as rest, but from the brain's perspective, sleep is an active period of organization and consolidation. During sleep, the nervous system strengthens important neural connections while reducing less useful ones. Skills practiced during the day become more stable. Information becomes easier to retrieve. Learning becomes more permanent. This means that your efforts don't end when you stop working. Your brain continues processing what you've practiced long after you've closed the book, finished the workout, or completed the project. Without adequate sleep, this consolidation becomes less effective. You may spend hours learning, but if your recovery is poor, your ability to retain that learning declines significantly. Consistency in recovery is just as important as consistency in effort. Focus also plays an essential role. Modern environments constantly compete for your attention. Notifications, entertainment, and endless streams of information train the brain to switch rapidly between tasks. While this may feel productive, frequent task switching reduces the depth of learning because the brain never remains engaged long enough to build strong neural representations. Deep focus is different. When you give your full attention to one meaningful task, the brain allocates greater resources toward that activity. Learning accelerates, problem-solving improves, memory strengthens. Over time, sustained attention itself becomes a skill. Like every other skill, it improves through practice. At first, maintaining focus for 20 or 30 minutes may feel difficult. Your mind searches for distractions because that's what it's been trained to expect. But every time you gently return your attention to the task, you're strengthening the neural systems responsible for concentration. You're literally practicing control over your own mind. This extends beyond work. The conversations you have, the books you read, the food you eat, the people you surround yourself with, the amount of movement you include in your day, the way you respond to stress. Each of these experiences contributes to the ongoing construction of your nervous system. People often underestimate how powerful small choices are because individual decisions seem insignificant. Skipping one workout doesn't appear life-changing. Reading 10 pages doesn't seem extraordinary. Going to bed 30 minutes earlier doesn't feel dramatic. But the brain doesn't evaluate isolated events. It responds to repeated patterns. Small decisions repeated consistently become biological changes. Those biological changes become psychological traits. And those psychological traits eventually become what others recognize as your personality. There's another important realization. Your environment influences your habits more than your intentions. If your surroundings constantly encourage distraction, unhealthy eating, poor sleep, or inactivity, maintaining positive routines becomes unnecessarily difficult. On the other hand, when your environment supports productive behaviors, consistency requires far less willpower. This isn't about removing every challenge from your life. It's about reducing unnecessary friction. If you want to read more, keep books where you can easily reach them. If you want to exercise, prepare your equipment in advance. If you want to reduce distractions, create periods where your attention is protected. Small environmental adjustments often produce surprisingly large behavioral changes because they reduce the number of decisions your brain must make. Over time, something remarkable happens. The habits that once required constant effort become automatic. The morning routine becomes natural. Focused work becomes expected. Exercise becomes part of your lifestyle, instead of a temporary challenge. Healthy decisions require less internal debate because your brain has already accepted them as normal. This is the true power of routine. It doesn't limit your freedom, it expands it. The less energy your brain spends negotiating healthy behaviors, the more energy becomes available for creativity, learning, relationships, and meaningful work. And eventually, when you look back after months or years, you'll realize that your life didn't change because of one extraordinary decision. It changed because of hundreds of ordinary decisions repeated with intention. Those daily actions quietly reshaped your brain, strengthened your character, and gradually transformed the person you became. Your routine was never just a schedule. It was the blueprint your nervous system used to build your future. Real change doesn't happen in one extraordinary moment. It happens in the quiet decisions nobody else sees. Every time you choose discipline over comfort, focus over distraction, and growth over excuses, you're literally reshaping the brain that shapes your life. Remember, you're never just building habits. You're building the person you'll become. So when you wake up tomorrow, don't ask, how do I change my life? Ask yourself, what action can I take today that my future self will thank me for? Because that single action repeated consistently has the power to transform everything. Thanks for watching. If you found value in this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's committed to becoming the best version of themselves. I'll see you in the next video.